This is Brennan here from B-Shep.net, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you all about the render tab thing. So let's get started. Let me show you all about this, specifically about the dimensions area. I'll show you how to get started. First of all, there's this little render drop down menu. You can click render. That will render an image. This is for rendering an image. As you can see, there's a camera, and that symbolizes making a picture or taking a snapshot of your scene in Blender. And right here, this is the animation button. So as you can see, render active scene. It says render active scene, which is the same things according to this. I don't know why it says the same thing, but well, it is basically rendering. Both of them are rendering the scene. So the only difference is that this is rendering an image. This is rendering an animation. It could be rendering multiple images. It could be rendering a video. The difference is, like I said, this is rendering animation, and animation. This is rendering an image. This button right here, this is for playing back your animation. If you render a still image, it is not going to be, that is not an animation, so you are not going to be playing anything back. As you can see, file C TMP0001 PNG not found. And that's because we haven't created an animation yet. But we're not going to do that for this tutorial. Of course, that's not the subject of this tutorial. So, be patient. Alright. Okay. So, this little menu right here, this is for, as you can see, it says display. That has to do with where you want the image to render. If you want the image to render in full screen, you select full screen. There we go. Full screen render. Perfect. Now, if you want it to render in a new window, which is kind of nice, you can click on render. And there we go. Perfect. Special cube. So, let's see. Keep UI. Let's try that. Keep UI, as you can clearly see, there's no change in the UI, which is the user interface. UI, it spells user interface. No, but anyway, you can do keep UI. That will keep the whole user interface as is. And if you want to see the image, you simply go to the UV image editor window, and there we go. If you don't have it selected, you can select render result, and you have it selected, and there's your image. So let's go ahead and see what other things are. Looks like that's all there is, and I usually just go with the default image editor, so it renders right here. I can just escape back into the 3D viewport and get back to work. So let's check out the layers drop-down menu. This is for all kinds of things. You can use this for compositing, and well, at least the only thing I've used it for is compositing. I'm not sure what else you can use it for, but it's basically has to do with all the render layers, as it says right here, render layer. This has to do with the layers in the scene. So anything that has to do with layers, you would want to change the settings here. I could show you in more depth in a tutorial in the future. But these are all just a lot of different settings. If you want to add vector blur, I've used that. I've never really used any of these other things, but these are all render passes. If you want to do motion blur, vector blur, you would use this right here, which is I've used in a few of my animations. Adds a nice look to if a object moves, it adds a nice look to it. It has a nice motion blur type look to it. Alright, so let's move on to dimensions. The dimensions drop-down menu is all the settings for the dimensions of the render. So if you're rendering let's just say you want to do 720 by 480, that changes the camera size. And I think you can actually, no you can't. That is where you change the camera. The resolution, basically the resolution of the camera. So whatever, if you change the size to the default setting 1920 by 1080, and as you can see, the camera has changed the size, the width, and the height, the X and Y. And that is the dimensions, and you can change the resolution. Well, these are all work together, but if you do 50% here, if you change this to 50%, if you render it out, it's half the size of 1920 by 1080, which whenever I've uploaded a video that's 50%, I get 720p on YouTube. If I do 100% and render that out, you get the full resolution 1920 by 1080. So enough of that. Let's move on to, this is the frame range. These settings are for where you want the frame to start, where you want it to end. You can also change that in the timeline window down here. If you go to timeline, right there, you can change the start and end of this animation or video. You can also change the frame step, which it says number of frames to skip forward while rendering or playing back each frame. So if you want it to skip 5 frames, it will skip, I think. I never really used this, but I have to learn what that is. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but let's move on. This is the aspect ratio. So if you'd like to change the aspect ratio, you can do that right here. And you can also change the frame rate. You can change frame rate to, let's just say you want to change the frame rate to 60 FPS. You can change it to whatever you want. I usually go with the default 24. I never really edit that, but there's also this border setting right here. You can turn on the border. You can select a specific area where you want to render your animation or render your image. And that's pretty much it. Let's move on to the anti-aliasing. This is very important if you want high quality images or a high quality render. So if you want your animation to be very high quality, in depth, the edges won't be jagged. Like I'll show you an example. If I turn this off, see that? There's a very jaggedy edge. And it turns out it renders faster, but it doesn't look very good. So I always use anti-aliasing. Just make sure that's turned on, and you will get the nice, clear image. Nice, clear, crisp image. You can also go with full sample. That takes longer, but I usually go with 16 anti-aliasing samples. Sampled motion blur, I never use that. I've never used it. This is the shading drop-down menu. This covers all, you can turn on and off all of the textures, shadows, subsurface scattering, environment environment map. So if you want to turn off shadows, I'll show an example. You can do that right here in the render settings. Let me show you with this checked. So you can see there's a shadow. And now, without this, there is no shadow. So right here in the render settings, you can turn off shadows. If you don't want any shadows, nothing interfering, or whatever you're trying to do, you can just turn off textures, turn off shadows, turn on shadows. You can change it, all the settings right here in the render shading drop-down menu. Now let's move on to performance. This has to do with your performance of your render. You can change the tile size. I'll just show you an example of this, 2.56. That will make the render tiles bigger, and that results in a faster rendering image. So if I turn it back to 66, as you can see, they're very small squares. It goes a lot slower if you make them like 5. Let's just do 8. They're very small now. So you probably want to go with something bigger. Why would you want to be waiting so long? Especially for something like this, a simple, nice cube. This is the memory. This has to do with how much it tells you right here. Save tiles for all render layers and scene nodes to files in the temp directory. Saves memory required for full sample. So if you want to save your memory, you can save buffers and it will keep scene nodes. It will save tiles for all render layers and scene nodes to files. So if you want to free image textures that aren't being used, just like free unused nodes in the compositing editor, you can do so right here. Not exactly sure all of these settings, I never really use them, but that's all I know pretty much. That's all I know so far. Here's the post-processing drop-down menu. You can turn on or off the compositing or sequencer. If you go to compositing, as you can see, we're not using any compositing, so we can just turn that off and that will not affect anything. Or if you're using sound, anything like that, this is the sequencer video editor. I'm pretty sure you can add sound in here. If you have sound, you would want this checked. But if not, go ahead and uncheck it. I usually don't. I usually leave these alone. They're usually checked. Doesn't really matter. As long as you're not using them. As long as you're not using compositing. I usually leave them checked because most of the time I am doing compositing or using the sequencer, adding sound, things like that. This is the dither, amount of dithering noise added to the rendered image to break up banding. I never used this before. This, you can add an edge. I've used this before. Not very often though. You can add edges to your image. Makes it look kind of cartoony, stylized type thing. You can also check fields that will render, that is for TV, for interlaced TV output. That's that. There's the stamp drop-down menu. You can select stamp and you can choose the font size, you can choose the color, you can choose the background color. You can, it will render everything, all of your information about your scene, or basically everything has to do with it. Time, how long it took to render, the camera, name, the lens, file name, marker. You can leave a note, you can leave your name. Right there, you can see it says Brennan. You can, there's a lot of things you can do with that stamp. That'd be good for, that would be, it could be used for testing, things like that, testing render times, just trying to see, telling how long it took you to render something and different things. So let's move on to the output and then bake. The output is for output. This is exporting where you want to put your file, where you'd like to export your file to. This is if you'd like to overwrite it. If you would like to overwrite an image or a video that you rendered out, then you check this. This is the file extensions if you want it to include the file extension. If it's a JPEG, if it's a PNG, it will say it's a PNG. It says add the file format extension to the rendered file name. It shows you an example file name plus .jpeg. So it will include the file extension with that. This setting right here is if you want to, when you're rendering, it will add placeholders in the folder you are rendering to, or the place you're rendering it to. So it will keep it, it will look like it's going to render, but it has placeholders. So those placeholders will be filled with the rendered image or whatever it may be. Because right here in this menu, you can render an image, any type of image, multiple types of images, or you can render a video. And the file type I would recommend for a video, especially uploading to YouTube, I would recommend the H.264 for uploading to YouTube. It's very good. It's fast for uploading to YouTube. It uploads very fast, and it's compressed. It's a small file size, and as opposed to rendering an AVI raw and uploading it to YouTube, that would take hours to upload. And that is why I suggest using H.264 or MPEG as an alternative to the AVI raw or other video file types. These are all the settings for the video if you're rendering a video. The audio codec, if you have audio in your animation or in your scene, you should turn on one of these. Select a file type, audio codec. I usually use MP3. The only way that you know that you need to turn this on, which if you are using audio, you have to select an audio type. And the way that you can tell that you are using audio is if you clicked on add in the video editing window. If you clicked on add sound, added a sound in there, you browse to your audio, added it in there, and that's how you tell. That's when you would use or select an audio type, audio codec. You can choose the rate, bit rate, audio codec, bit rate, volume. You can choose lots of different options. JPEG, the quality. When you're rendering an image, you want to turn up the quality to 100%, or else you won't get the full quality of the image. H.264, it renders the full quality if you have 100% the resolution. And the same goes for an image, but for the video, there's no full quality. Really, there's no quality percentage to change. So if you're rendering a video, these are the settings I would recommend. Now, this is the Bake drop-down menu. It has a few things. There's if you want to bake, I've only used this for ambient occlusion in the game engine. It works very nicely for if you want to bake textures. So if you want to bake shadows, if there's a static object, like let's just say this cube, let's just say it's a building, you can bake the shadows. You can use ambient occlusion to make fake shadows, and it looks nice, makes a nice stylized look or cartoony type look to the game. So that's pretty much it. There's all kinds of options you can do. You can use normalized, clear. I'm not exactly sure what all these do, but there's a lot of settings in this render tab. So that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment, like, subscribe